When a medical device fails, it leaves evidence. The fracture surface tells you whether the material failed in tension or in compression, in fatigue or in a single overload event. The burn pattern on a circuit board tells you where the current went when it went somewhere it was not supposed to go. The wear marks on a mechanical component tell you about the kinematics of the failure, the direction of the force, the duration of the abnormal loading, the geometry of the contact that should not have been occurring. A failed medical device is a document. It is a record of everything that was done to it, everything that was done wrong in its manufacture, and everything that was concealed from the people whose lives depended on it working correctly. I have spent 17 years learning to read that document. I can tell you, from a careful examination, whether a device failed because of how it was used or because of how it was made or because of what someone decided not to disclose about what had been done to it before it reached the patient. Every one of those origins leaves a different signature. Every one of those signatures is legible if you know the language. I did not expect that the most important document I would ever read in this language would belong to my father. My name is Mara Denson. I am a biomedical engineer with a specialization in medical device quality systems and failure analysis. I spent the first 8 years of my career at a major device manufacturer working in quality engineering, the function responsible for ensuring that products leaving the factory match their design specifications, that manufacturing processes are validated and controlled, and that when something goes wrong in production the investigation is thorough enough to find the actual root cause rather than the convenient one. Quality engineering is the conscience of a device company, or it is supposed to be. It is the part of the organization that is supposed to ask uncomfortable questions before a patient is in a position to ask them. I was good at asking uncomfortable questions, which made me valued by some people and difficult for others, and I left after 8 years to start my own consulting practice where I could ask uncomfortable questions on behalf of whoever hired me to ask them: hospitals, insurance companies, plaintiffs' attorneys, regulatory bodies. I do failure analysis, regulatory compliance work, and expert witness testimony in litigation involving device failures. I have examined failed implants, failed infusion systems, failed surgical instruments, and failed diagnostic equipment across a career that spans 17 years and somewhere north of 400 individual device examinations. I know what a device looks like when it was made correctly and failed through legitimate use. I know what it looks like when it was made incorrectly and the manufacturing deficiency was the cause. And I know what it looks like when the documentation surrounding a device has been managed specifically to obscure what actually happened, when the paper that is supposed to describe the device's history has been curated rather than completed. That last category is the most time-consuming to document correctly, because it requires you to read not just the device but the gap between the device and the record that claims to describe it. I have done that work for 9 years. I did it once for my father, and the gap I found was significant. His name is Harold. He is 76 years old and he has had type 1 diabetes since he was 19, which means he has been actively managing a condition requiring precise insulin dosing for 57 years. 57 years of functioning as his own pancreas, making dosing decisions multiple times daily based on glucose readings, meal composition, activity level, stress, sleep quality, and dozens of other variables that intersect and compound in ways that most people do not have to consider. He is meticulous about this management in a way that only people who have lived inside a serious chronic condition for that long can be meticulous, not anxiously, not obsessively, but with the quiet integrated thoroughness of someone for whom the management has long since become as automatic as breathing and as precise as engineering. He knows his glucose response patterns the way a pilot knows an instrument panel, the specific lag between a particular meal and its glucose effect, the correction factor that reliably returns him to range, the overnight drift that requires a small pre-sleep adjustment, the early physical sensations that tell him something is off before the number on his meter confirms it. He managed his diabetes with multiple daily injections for most of his adult life and transitioned to an insulin pump 4 years ago at the recommendation of his endocrinologist, who believed the pump's continuous microdosing capability would improve his time in range and reduce the hypoglycemic episodes he had been experiencing more frequently as he aged. The transition went well. His control improved substantially. His endocrinologist reviewed his quarterly data with genuine satisfaction, the specific clinical pleasure of watching an intervention work exactly as intended. He called me after his first good quarterly appointment and said, "Mara, it is the best my numbers have been in 20 years. I said, "I am glad, Dad." Then, over the course of about 5 months beginning roughly 18 months after his transition, the numbers stopped making sense. His glucose levels began spiking in ways he could not correlate to anything. Not to meals he had eaten incorrectly or activity he had miscalculated or any variable he had 57 years of experience tracking. The spikes were unpredictable in their timing and in their magnitude, appearing at intervals that did not correspond to his dosing schedule or his activity patterns or anything in the environmental record he kept. His endocrinologist adjusted his basal rates, the continuous background delivery rate the pump maintains throughout the day. The adjustments produced brief periods of improvement that did not hold. He had 2 significant hyperglycemic episodes requiring emergency room visits, the first acute diabetes-related crises he had experienced in years, the kind of events that had become unusual enough in his management that they were now alarming rather than expected. His endocrinologist was thorough and genuinely puzzled. She ordered additional blood work looking for changes in his insulin sensitivity, changes in his insulin absorption kinetics, any autoimmune or endocrine variable that might explain why a regimen that had been working reliably for over a year had suddenly stopped working. She found nothing that cleanly explained the variability. After the second visit, she recommended replacing the pump as a precautionary measure, noting that the device was approaching the end of its standard warranty period and that a new device would eliminate the pump as a variable and give them a clean baseline to work from. She filed a complaint with the manufacturer through the standard medical device complaint channel. My father received a replacement pump. Within 2 weeks his glucose levels had stabilized. Within a month his time in range was back to where it had been in the first year post-transition, before the problems began. The presenting explanation was that the pump had been failing as it aged and the replacement had resolved it. He called me after the second emergency room visit, not to ask me to investigate anything but because he had been frightened and we are close, and that is what he does when something has genuinely frightened him, calls me, says it plainly, and I know from his voice the difference between telling me and asking for help. This was telling me. He described the variability, the 2 visits, the endocrinologist's decision, the rapid improvement with the new pump. He mentioned, as a detail at the end, that the manufacturer had contacted him after the complaint was filed, had been apologetic and attentive, and had asked if they could have the failed device returned to them for their own internal failure analysis. He had agreed. The device had been shipped back. He told me all of this in the tone of someone describing the administrative closure of a situation that had already resolved. I asked him the manufacturer name. I asked him the device model number. He told me both. I sat with those 2 pieces of information and what I knew about them for a moment, and then I said, Dad, I need you to call them today and ask them to preserve that device without conducting any analysis on it until I have had the opportunity to examine it independently. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Don't you trust that they will analyze it correctly? I said, I trust that they will conduct an analysis. I want to conduct one independently and in parallel. He said, Is there something wrong with the company? I said, I do not know yet. That is what I am trying to determine. I said, Will you make the call? He said yes. I want to be precise about what I was thinking when I made that request, because I think it matters and because I want to be honest that I was not thinking fraud. I was thinking about a real and well-documented limitation of internal failure analysis that does not require deliberate wrongdoing to produce incomplete results, the tendency of any investigator examining their own organization's product to stop when they find a finding that is sufficient to close the investigation. You identify a manufacturing variation that could plausibly explain the failure. You document it. You initiate a corrective action. You close the complaint. You do not necessarily follow every thread to its end, because following every thread is expensive and time-consuming, and the finding you already have satisfies the formal requirement to investigate. An independent examiner with no stake in a particular conclusion, no time pressure from an internal corrective action process, and no organizational investment in a finding that is manageable rather than complete will follow all of the threads. That was what I wanted to provide. An independent pair of eyes with full access to the physical evidence and no reason to stop at the convenient answer. Nothing more than that, at the outset. The manufacturer agreed to preserve the device and allow me independent access after my father signed a release authorizing them to share his device records with me as his designated representative. 3 weeks later I drove to their regional service center with my portable examination kit, a stereo microscope, calibrated measurement tools, a good camera, a chain of custody log, and sample containers for any material evidence I needed to preserve for subsequent analysis. I examined the device for 4 hours, working systematically from exterior to interior, documenting every step in the chain of custody record with timestamps, photographing every finding before and after any disassembly. An insulin pump is a small and precisely engineered electromechanical system. It contains an insulin reservoir, a drive mechanism, typically a stepper motor driving a lead screw that advances a plunger against the reservoir, to deliver insulin through the infusion tubing and subcutaneous cannula, a microcontroller that governs delivery according to the programmed basal rate and any bolus commands entered by the patient, and an array of sensors and alarms for detecting occlusions in the delivery pathway, motor errors, low reservoir conditions, and battery status. When a pump produces incorrect insulin delivery, the failure can originate in any of those subsystems. Occlusions are the most common failure mode and are generally the most readily detected, because a properly functioning occlusion alarm will alert the patient when the delivery pathway is blocked and insulin cannot reach them. Reservoir-related failures, air entrainment, degraded insulin, improper priming, are the second most common category. Drive mechanism failures, meaning problems with the motor or the lead screw assembly that advance the plunger, should be uncommon in a properly manufactured and maintained device. They are also, when they occur, the failure mode most likely to produce the specific clinical presentation my father had experienced, intermittent underdelivery of insulin without a consistent occlusion alarm, because the motor is turning and the controller is commanding delivery and the system's internal fault detection is looking for blockages and pressure anomalies rather than for motor speed deviation, but the insulin is not being delivered at the commanded rate because the motor is not running at the commanded speed. The patient's glucose rises in ways that do not correspond to their dosing regimen. The physician adjusts the settings. The adjustments help briefly. The intermittent deviation continues. The clinical picture looks like a management problem. It is a device problem. I want to tell you something about what it feels like to examine a device knowing that the patient whose device it was is someone you have known your whole life. I have been asked this question in depositions and in interviews, and I will tell you what I have always said: the examination itself felt the same. The stereo microscope does not care whose device is on the stage. The chain of custody log does not know that the patient named in the header is your father. The methodology does not change because the stakes are personal. If anything, the stakes being personal make you more careful, because you understand with absolute clarity that an error in your methodology will be found and used, and that allowing your concern for your father to accelerate your conclusions rather than your thoroughness would be the worst possible way to try to help him. I have examined devices for clients I have never met, and I have examined this device for my father, and the physical examination was conducted identically. What was different was what happened after I documented each finding and stopped working for a moment and sat with the weight of what I was looking at. The methodology held. The weight was heavier than usual. What I found on the drive mechanism of my father's pump was wear patterning on the lead screw inconsistent with 3 years of normal operation at the commanded delivery rates. The wear was excessive in absolute terms and distinctly patterned in a way that, to someone trained in mechanical failure analysis, told a specific story. The motor had been operating intermittently at a speed different from what the controller was commanding. Not a constant offset in speed that would have produced a uniform and predictable underdelivery. An intermittent deviation, periods of correct speed alternating with periods of incorrect speed, of the kind that would produce exactly the variable, unpredictable glucose excursions my father had been experiencing and his endocrinologist had been unable to attribute to any patient or management variable she could identify. That finding alone would have been a legitimate and documentable manufacturing defect. It would have been sufficient to support the filed complaint and to prompt a formal corrective action investigation from the manufacturer. I documented it fully and moved to the next element of my examination. On 2 fasteners securing the motor assembly, I found something I was not expecting. The thread-locking compound securing those fasteners was different from the compound used on every other fastener in the assembly. Thread-locking compound is applied during original factory assembly to prevent fasteners from loosening under the vibration of normal device operation. The specific compound, its formulation, its color, its application pattern, is part of the manufacturing process specification. It is consistent across all fasteners assembled at the same facility during the same production period because they all come from the same controlled process using the same material. These 2 fasteners had been retorqued. They had been opened after the original assembly, resecured with a different compound, and the evidence of that retorquing was visible in the compound bead pattern, a hand-applied field service bead rather than the controlled factory application visible on every surrounding fastener. Someone had opened the motor assembly of my father's pump after it left the manufacturing facility. That service event did not appear in the device's official service history. The service record I had been provided documented no prior repairs, no field service, no returns for maintenance of any kind prior to the complaint that led to his replacement pump. The physical evidence of a repair was present in the device. The paper record of that repair was absent. I want to be careful about what I am saying and what I am not saying at this point in the story, because precision matters. I am saying that the physical evidence was inconsistent with the official service record. I am saying that two fasteners had been retorqued with a different compound than the original assembly. I am saying that the service record showed no prior repair. What I am not saying, on the basis of the device examination alone, is that I knew why the service record was incomplete. There are scenarios in which an undisclosed prior service is the product of negligence rather than deliberate concealment, a repair event that was not properly logged due to administrative failure rather than intent. I documented what the device showed me. I did not characterize intent on the basis of physical evidence. That is not how failure analysis works, and it is not how credible expert testimony is built. What I had was a discrepancy between the physical evidence and the documentation. What that discrepancy meant, and how it had come to exist, was a question for the investigation that would follow. I documented everything. I photographed every finding. I logged every observation with timestamps. I thanked the service center staff for their time and cooperation, collected my equipment and my chain of custody record, and drove home. I called a regulatory attorney I had worked with on 2 prior FDA enforcement matters and described my findings. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Undisclosed prior service on a device in active complaint status." I said yes. She said, "We file a MedWatch report today." MedWatch is the FDA's adverse event and malfunction reporting system for medical devices. Filing that report was not a decision we deliberated over. We filed within 24 hours, with my complete examination documentation and chain of custody record attached. The FDA opened a formal inquiry. As part of that inquiry, they requested the manufacturer's complete complaint records for the device model across a 3-year period. What those records showed was an elevated rate of glycemic control failure complaints, patients reporting the same pattern of unexplained glucose variability my father had experienced, at a rate above the baseline the manufacturer had projected in their pre-market submissions to the FDA. The complaints had been tracked and were present in the database. The majority had been categorized by the manufacturer as attributable to user error, patient physiology variability, or infusion site issues, the categories that locate the cause of the failure outside the device and outside the manufacturer's corrective action obligation. Categorized that way, the aggregate complaint rate had not reached the manufacturer's internal threshold for a formal corrective action, and that threshold itself was subsequently reviewed and found by FDA staff to be set at a level inadequate for the risk profile of this device and this patient population. The undisclosed servicing on my father's specific device was a distinct thread from the aggregate complaint pattern, but the facility inspection that followed wound those threads together in a way that made the full picture legible. The inspection found that during a period of approximately 8 months, certain device units had been returned from distributors with a specific motor component issue, repaired at the manufacturer's facility under a documented internal process, and redeployed into distribution inventory without the individual device repair events being logged in a way that created patient-level traceability. The internal work instruction that documented the repair procedure and the retesting protocol did not address how repaired devices would be distinguished from unrepaired devices in the distribution chain after they returned to inventory, and the inspection found contemporaneous internal communications indicating that this omission was not accidental. The decision had been made not to distinguish them. Repaired devices returned to inventory and moved through distribution into patients' hands with no marking, no notation in the accompanying documentation, and no mechanism by which a patient, a physician, or a pharmacist receiving the device could know that it had been opened. The people whose insulin delivery depended on those devices had not been told that those devices had been opened. My father was not the only patient who received one of those devices. He was the one whose daughter had 17 years of failure analysis experience, a stereo microscope, and the professional discipline to look at the physical evidence rather than accept the documentation that described it. The aftermath of what I found did not feel the way I expected it to feel when I was driving to that service center. It did not feel like vindication. It did not feel like winning. It felt like being right about something I had spent 4 hours desperately hoping to be wrong about. The best outcome I could have found that day was a device with a clean service record, a legitimate and fully documented failure mechanism, a manufacturer whose own analysis was complete and accurate. I wanted to drive home and tell my father, the system worked, the complaint was handled correctly, here is what failed and why, you can trust the next device. I did not find that. I found thread locking compound in the wrong color on 2 fasteners. I found a wear pattern that told a story the paper record had omitted. Those findings led where they led. The manufacturer entered a consent decree with the FDA in the summer of 2026. The decree required a comprehensive corrective action plan addressing the complaint handling and categorization procedures, an independent third-party audit of the quality management system, enhanced post-market surveillance protocols for the affected device category, and individual patient notification to people who may have received devices during the relevant redeployment period. 3 individuals in the manufacturer's quality and regulatory leadership were named in the consent decree by title and action. The company's stock declined substantially in the days following the public announcement. I was deposed 3 times in connection with the FDA enforcement action and the civil class action filed on behalf of other affected patients. In each deposition I was asked, at length and by skilled counsel, whether my personal relationship to one of the affected patients had influenced my findings. My answer was the same each time: my relationship to my father is the reason I examined the device. The findings are what the device contained when I examined it. Those are 2 separate facts, and only one of them is evidence. I said it each time without embellishment because it is the truth and the truth does not require embellishment. My father's replacement pump has been functioning correctly for over a year. His endocrinologist told him at his most recent quarterly appointment that his 3-month glucose data was the best she had seen from him in 4 years. He called me after that appointment and said, "The numbers are good, Mara." He said it quietly, once, the way he says the things that matter to him most, without adding anything to them. I said, "I know, Dad." I said, "I'm glad." Both of those things were true. They are still true. They coexist with other things that are also true, with the knowledge of what it took to arrive at good numbers and with the specific feeling, which does not have a clean name, of knowing that the numbers would have continued to not make sense if I had been a different kind of daughter. The device does not lie. That is the foundational conviction of this work, and it remains true even when someone has attempted to make the device harder to read. You can falsify a service record. You can categorize complaints in the column that keeps the aggregate rate below the threshold that requires action. You can write an internal work instruction that describes a repair practice without addressing how that practice will be disclosed to the patients who receive the repaired devices. What you cannot do is change the color of thread locking compound after it has cured, or remove the wear signature a motor leaves on a lead screw when it runs at the wrong speed for long enough to matter. The physical evidence survives the documentation management. It is patient and it is permanent and it is waiting in the metal for someone who knows how to read it. I have thought a great deal, since this case concluded, about what it means to practice in a field where you are simultaneously the person most capable of protecting people from a specific kind of harm and the person least likely to be in the right position to protect the people closest to you. I have spent 17 years building the expertise to read device failures. That expertise was available to my father only because I am his daughter and I had the standing to request access to his device and the equipment to examine it and the professional relationships to file a regulatory report within 24 hours of finding something that required reporting. Most patients who received a device from the affected batch did not have a daughter in failure analysis. Most of them had a physician who received a replacement device request and processed it through the standard warranty channel and moved on to the next patient, because there was no visible reason to do otherwise. The system that is supposed to protect those patients is the complaint database and the FDA surveillance function and the manufacturer's internal corrective action processes. Those systems exist. They are imperfect. They work better when individual data points, individual complaints, individual device returns, individual MedWatch reports, are contributed completely and accurately, because the pattern only becomes visible when the data is complete. My father's complaint, filed by his endocrinologist through the standard channel, was in the database. It was categorized as a product performance complaint and assigned to the aggregate analysis. It would not, on its own, have changed the outcome. What changed the outcome was the examination of the physical device and the MedWatch report that attached specific physical findings to a specific unit number. One specific thread pulled tight, the whole pattern became visible. I also want to say something about Harold himself, because I have told you about his management and his numbers and his phone calls and I have not told you who he is, and I think he deserves more than to be the patient at the center of a regulatory proceeding. He is a man who coached my little league team for 3 seasons when I was 9, 10, and 11 years old, who did not know anything about baseball when he started and had read 4 books about coaching by the time the first practice happened. He is a man who drove me to the university library every Saturday morning for 2 years so I could do research for a science fair project on microelectronics that I was, in retrospect, almost certainly too young for, and who sat in the parking lot reading a paperback for 2 hours each time without once complaining. He is a man who has managed a serious and demanding chronic illness with such consistent competence and such complete lack of self-pity for 57 years that I did not fully appreciate, until I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of his endocrinologist's building after the second ER visit, how much energy that had cost him for how long. He did not deserve to have 2 emergency room visits added to that accounting because someone in a manufacturing facility decided that redeployed devices did not need to be individually documented. He deserved the device his endocrinologist prescribed for him to work the way it was described, every day, without exception. That is a baseline expectation. It is not a high bar. It was not met. His numbers are good now. They have been good for over a year. When he calls me on my birthday, which he always does, in the morning, the way he always has, his voice sounds the way it sounded before the ER visits, which is to say like a man who is tired in the ordinary way of a 76-year-old rather than the specific exhausted tired of someone whose body has been fighting something it cannot account for. I notice that difference every time we talk and I am glad of it every time. If you or someone in your life uses a medical device and their clinical picture changes in a way that cannot be fully explained, and particularly if that picture improved substantially when the device was replaced, it is worth asking whether a device complaint was formally filed with the manufacturer. It is worth asking whether the failed device was preserved for independent analysis rather than returned to the manufacturer immediately. It is worth knowing that you have the right to request that preservation and the right to designate a representative with appropriate technical expertise to examine the device on your behalf before any analysis is performed. These are not dramatic or adversarial requests. They are exactly the requests that the FDA's post-market surveillance framework was built to support. The regulatory system for medical devices functions best when patients and families engage with it actively and specifically. Complaints filed, devices preserved, independent analyses requested, these are the mechanisms that produce the data that produces the enforcement actions that change the practices. The device keeps the record. Sometimes you just need someone who knows how to read it. Share this if it reached you. Follow this channel for more. And if you have been through a device failure that did not receive a complete explanation, leave that in the comments. I will see you next time.